Hello, out there on the internet. My name is Bret, and I'm back on my channel this week after a successful Dockercon last week. Hopefully you showed up or saw a little something yet last week. So let's get into some announcements related to that and all the things that happened, and then I'm going to take your questions. I have no guests today, so this is a week all about whatever the topic is that you want to talk about. I'd say course questions because that's what I hope to help people with if they're going through courses, not just mine, but hopefully mine. And, seeing what you're working on, what the problems are, seeing if I have anything to help with. All right, so let's get right to it because last week was a huge week because of Dockercon. So I spent months working with the Dockercon team on making sure we had live panelists all day, getting all the great volunteers that showed up to talk about things like GitOps and continuous integration and testing with containers, to the last panel I had was around sysadmin lists, and basically the idea of a future where we're not managing individual servers, we're not shelling into servers, we don't care even about the OS necessarily because that's provided by some other team, whether that's a team inside your company that's making your own private cloud or a cloud on the internet, right? So that was Dockercon last week. And we had a lot of fun. It was all day long. I'm going to put this link in the chat because this is where it's kind of living now. And that they had a great little Star Wars and all the tropes in the beginning of the keynote, which I didn't know they were going to do, but I thought that was pretty fantastic. And it was really cool with the whole space theme thing. So I had 3 live shows. So this is all free, by the way. Go check that out. There was DockerCon stuff all day. So lots of content, not just about Docker, but also Kubernetes, other container tools, but a lot around things like build kit and how, and the sort of the things you can do beyond just the standard Docker build commands, and how people are finding new and creative ways to use Docker tools or just images and containers in general. So, and this was kind of fun. This whole space people. I don't really understand much of it, but supposedly. So anyway, you can go there and look at the live panels day throughout the day. So down there at the bottom, there's the live panels. That's where I was all day. You can watch these here if you sign up, or if you want to wait a couple of weeks on YouTube. I think that they will all be available on Docker's channel on YouTube. All right, and then after that, well, actually during that event, they announced a 20% off, which I don't know that they've ever done at Docker on their Hub plans. And of course, I talk a little bit about how Hub now, when you get the subscription to Hub, you get support for Docker Desktop. So when you have problems, you can actually email someone. It's not phone support, but it is, you can contact them and they will help you. So that's the thing. I pay for Docker Hub because I don't want to be restricted on my pools, and I have a lot of images there. And I know that they use a lot of bandwidth. When I start to go look at things like my own images, and I realize that they've been downloaded in some cases millions of times. Let's see. So yeah, 100,000 plus downloads on that one. The Jekyll server, 100,000 plus. I thought I had one that was 1 million, but I could be wrong. Yeah, lots of 100,000 plus, but can I sort by? No, can't sort. So, meh. Anyway, so I take up a lot of their bandwidth. So I felt like, $5 a month, I could totally do that for them. Anyway, so they have a pricing discount for the year. So go check this out. I will put this in chat. And you get a 20% off the yearly subscription to Docker Hub with that link. And that's going to be going, that discount will go through next week. So, and I believe that's on, I don't think there's a limit to the plan. So if your team is on the fence about doing something like Docker Hub, then consider that. All right. The other things I want to talk about are there some upcoming events, and GetOpsDays, sponsored by Weaveworks. And I'm sure there's other sponsors that I don't know about. So GetOpsDays, check that out. There's a lot of people that you will see there that were at Dockercon. And this is next week. It's also free. And you will see, like Victor I had on my show. Justin Cormack was all over the keynote. And you have other community leaders. Dan Pop. We had Sivo. We had people from Sivo on that week. So you have a whole bunch of people that are just sort of leaders in the container space that are going to show up there, right? I use a ton of Stefan's stuff. You probably seen me talk about his stuff, whether it's Swarm-based or Kubernetes-based. He has a lot of GitHub stuff that's really good. And, stuff's going on there. So getopsdays.com, that's next week. And then as a part of that, I noticed that, after KubeCon, because there's hundreds of sessions at KubeCon, there's lots of people that are making, sort of summaries on different themes. And Weaveworks did their own blog article on a recap of Kubernetes, of KubeCon, of Cloud Native Con. So one of the problems with KubeCon is I don't even know where to start. So, when there's 200 plus videos, I'm just kind of overwhelmed, so I don't make a choice. So I tend to like following these narratives in the blog posts, and I put that in chat because it kind of takes me down a story that I can follow the videos and, watch the first one a little bit, maybe skip around, watch some of the second one, and so I like these kind of summaries because I don't want to go through 250 videos trying to figure out which ones I want and then adding them to some list of bookmarks and then clearing my schedule to watch them all, right? So I'm a little lazy like that. And that's it for the news. So I don't have anything else, although this week I'm getting back into my course updates and working on a whole bunch of ARM stuff that continues to be challenging in the courses with people that are now trying on Mac M1s, trying to do the course, and I have various things in automation. Most of it is all moving to GitHub Actions to build the images, update the images, because all of my stuff being on GitHub, I get a lot of these security updates, right? And I always want to keep the images as secure as possible, even though it's all running in containers, so there's not much risk there to your host system because whatever insecure code is in there is not exposed on the internet when you're taking my courses. But anyway, I try to keep that stuff up just to be a good net citizen and show how maybe you can do it as well. So one of the challenges there is I keep breaking things, sadly. And lately, one of the challenges is one of the tools that I use in my courses called HTTP ping. That's HTTP ing, HTTP ping. It might be HTTP ping, actually, now that I think about it. I can never remember whether there's two P's in there or not. Anyway, it's a tool that's like curl, but it also is like ping. So it's like curl and ping had a baby, and that is HTTP ping. So that tool sort of fell off the internet. The owner of that open source removed the repo from GitHub. And this is actually a really good story around if you're using even popular open source that is available in all the major distributions of Linux, and I make a container image of it. The owner just didn't want it on the internet anymore, and we don't know why. So they pulled it and their entire account off of GitHub. I can't find the source anywhere else, at least no place that I would trust. I basically didn't find it at all. But I didn't fork it, right? I only made an image of their source code and used their upstream, and I didn't, sadly, fork their open source into my own GitHub. So now I have no way to build their open source to put back into my courses. So one of the problems is that if I want to rebuild the container image, I don't have a way to do that. So now I'm looking for alternatives, right? I'm going to have to shift the entire course. I have two courses and a lot of other material that's all pointing to this tool that no longer kind of exists on the internet. And now we have to figure out, do we just want to keep using the old version that they last had and we sort of store it forever because it's still open source, at least in terms of the fact that whatever I have, I can still use because it was licensed properly? Or do I have to go find an alternative and completely replace those sections of the course with a different tool called something else? Anyway, tell me your thoughts, because this is, I can think the first time this has actually happened, but it's not unlike this in open source. One of the challenges with open source is the original creators can just up and move or leave and take their stuff with them. And unless it's super huge project, it's not obvious to find where the forks are. Now, the challenge with GitHub, and I actually gave GitHub some feedback, was someone else showed up and parked in their place in GitHub. So when you go to that account now, it's a different account. It's a different person. And they're kind of doing some shady stuff with repos where they're making repos that were like the old ones. They're the same name, and there's the same stuff isn't in there. So that's an example where I realize that could actually hurt me, because if I'm building based on their GitHub repos and that GitHub repo goes away and then a squatter comes in and replaces it, I'm now building different code, a totally different code base from a totally different author. It's weird that GitHub lets you do that. I find it weird that GitHub lets someone jump on to someone with thousands of stars in their GitHub and just jump into their account and pretend to be them. So I warned their policy people, and all I got back was, we're looking at it. About a month later. So who knows what's going to happen. But one of the challenges is I don't have a copy of the source code. So anyway, let me back up. Let's see what questions y'all got today. Hello, everyone. Alexandra, did I try Visual Studio Dev Container? Yes. Yeah, that's been around a while, and I think it's definitely ideal for use in WSL2, where you have that VM in there. And so the people that I work with that use WSL2 on a day-to-day basis, they use Dev Container all the time. I am not someone who uses it every day, because I kind of had my own setup before Dev Containers came out as a plugin to Visual Studio Code. But yeah, I use it. Well, thank you so much, Eduardo. Thank you. Yeah, the live events, the analogy to video games. So that was my favorite Dockercon talk of all time, actually, was going through Docker production setup steps. This was like 2017, and I had a Dockercon keynote where I just was bored with the slides, and I was bored with boring talk, so I threw in video game trivia. And I made the sound people turn it up really, really loud. I was like, I would do a test with them before, and they had these huge speakers, and I would have them turn it up really loud. So then when the video game music came on, and I asked people to guess which old video game, which 80s retro video game it was, based on the sound, they had to yell it out. It was a lot of fun. I did that talk at least 4 or 5 times at different conferences. So, Pratish, let's see. My question is Docker and Kubernetes only for software developers? So who else would use it? Like, I mean, what else are you saying for normal people, or are you talking about for operations people? Maybe ask the question a little bit different, because software developers is sometimes a vague term that we can assume that is also people in the DevOps space, maybe in the operations space, basically anyone who has to deal with software, whether it's building the software, writing software, deploying software, anything like that, they're going to have to know Docker and Kubernetes eventually. It's just a matter of time. They may not be in a job now where they're using Docker in that company, but if not, they're already behind the times, and they will eventually have to either catch up, or that person will probably get a new job because that company probably won't exist. Bucker says you have HTTP ping 2.5 zip. Yeah. What I might have to do is, I was building from source, and I wonder if maybe I can get the apt packages and just archive those for safekeeping or something. I don't know. I'm not sure what my long-term plan is for HTTP ping. I kind of don't want to use a tool knowing that the original author, there's no maintainers that are maintaining it, and the original author has basically ghosted the tool. I'd rather promote tools that are being supported and maintained. So my plan is probably to leave it as is, because it does at least work today in most cases. I do have a bug inside of my SH pod, it seems like, that I just discovered from a student letting me know. But other than that, I will probably find there's a different variant. If you just go kind of looking up HTTP ping stuff, you can find a Go-based one. There's other ideas about how to use it. A lot of them don't have the same amount of features, but I will probably just want to pick another open source tool that does that same thing in my courses. I don't know. That way, you're supporting the current open source and the people that are making it today. Jason says, maybe try to get the original creator on the show. Well, that person, I'm not going to name their names. I'm not calling anybody out on the internet, but from what I can tell, that person has completely left the internet. Their Twitter account is gone. Their website is gone. Their GitHub account is gone. So my guess was that they no longer want to be contacted. I wouldn't presume to go hunt them down. And I'm not asking you all to go hunt this person down, because whatever their reasons are, they had those reasons. And I'm not trying to, find out what the problem is or whatever. I think it was written in C, I think. And so, I mean, it's not going to be something I support. Anyway. What are my upcoming courses this year? I think for this year, all my goal is for the rest of the year is to update the current courses, replace some of the videos that are outdated, and then add more sections to improve them, make them bigger, better, longer. I don't have a plan. I have plenty of courses in the pipeline that I want to do or I've started to work on, but I don't think that those will get released this year because we're almost halfway through the year. And knowing, I have hundreds and hundreds of videos in my courses already that are now years old, and a lot of them need to be either refreshed or tweaked a little bit. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time on that. Is it a good practice to use Docker Compose in Jenkins? Yes. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's good or bad. I would say that a lot of people use Docker Compose in a lot of places. And really what you're using Docker Compose for is to replace either the really long Docker run lines that you might be running. Now, there are different plugins for different CI solutions that might automate some of that for you so that you don't have to manually type in Docker run commands. But Docker Compose files can also be a way to do that. Docker Compose can also be used to start up containers before you run another one that maybe has your testing in it. So I think it kind of depends on the platform. I am not a Jenkins expert, and certainly not an expert in all the plugins that are out there, because there's tons of Docker stuff in their ecosystem. And so what I tend to look for is a way for the tool, especially in the new pipelines YAML description way of doing things. I want tools to do the automation for me. I don't want to have to write a bunch of scripts that do the automation. If I'm writing a bunch of bash scripts, then why do I even have Jenkins in the first place? Basically, if there's this is why I like GitHub Actions and some of these more modern tools, because they have a plugin ecosystem, an add-on ecosystem that really takes a lot of the work out of me needing to write shell scripts for every single action I want to take, every single step, right? And so so for example, in the GitHub Actions world, there is a Docker build one that has a bunch of options in it, and I don't have to write any scripts or any commands. I'm never actually typing shell commands. I'm simply filling out a YAML template, and then it will build the image. It'll build it for multiple platforms if I want it to. It'll set custom tags based on what I want. There's lots of stuff there, and it all is in YAML so that I'm not building scripts and then maintaining those scripts. I'd rather, because you're always going to have the YAML or the description file. I don't want to also have to maintain more scripts after that. So what I'm always trying to do is create a workflow, a series of steps in workflow that allow me to do things like linting or security scanning and stuff like that without writing a 200-line bash script to do all that. Because if I am going to do all that, then you basically are just building your own cron underneath these CI solutions. So I would rather use the CI native features. But Docker Compose can be used in a way to do that. So for example, in some CI solutions, you can have it spin up other containers, and it has this concept of things that need to be done before you run the tests. And so those solutions, you can usually find blog articles or descriptions on how you would use those tools to spin up your database container and seed it, and then start up the API, and then start a testing container that maybe hits the API remotely. So when you're doing stuff like that, you can always do that with Docker Compose and scripting, but there might be an easier way in your CI tool to just use the built-in stuff or some of the plugins that come with it or the popular plugins. Anyway, again, I'm not really a Jenkins person, so I sort of left Jenkins years ago and never looked back. So whenever I'm on a project with teams that use Jenkins, and a lot of people still use it, it's still, I think, the majority of people in surveys still use Jenkins. I rely on someone else who is the Jenkins expert, and I just tend to give them advice on whether what they're doing with containers in there is the best way to do it, maybe. Why is there not a Helm certification? I spend more time figuring it out, the Helm files, than kube control commands. So the Kubernetes certifications are all managed by the Linux Foundation, and Helm, there isn't a lot to Helm, right? Because now that we no longer have the older versions of Helm, we're really just editing the YAML templates and dealing with some Helm commands. So there's maybe some workflow commands, but what we don't see in the space is certifications on small little tools, right? Like you could sort of name a dozen tools that go inside of a Kubernetes typical cluster, and you could argue, why doesn't each one of those have its own certification? And maybe in time we will. Maybe in 10 years we'll have a dozen different certifications related to tools inside of Kubernetes. But they just released the Kubernetes security certifications, so it's not like they're done releasing certifications. They're just focusing on the big hits, right? The big stuff that everybody's using. Not everybody's using Helm, although at this point, even if you don't want to use Helm, you still kind of have to use it sometimes. So. Pratish is back. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Storage admin looking to get into Docker and Kubernetes, but it looks like folks into it are mostly software developers, hence the question. So a storage admin, so what you may be relied upon to understand is how containers work. I think if you're in IT, if you have a job in IT, then you need to understand Docker, basically. It's like saying you're in IT, but you don't understand servers at this point, or you don't understand how to get into a server and type commands. Like, you're kind of just assumed to have that basic level of knowledge. And so with Docker, I would assume if I had anyone on the storage team, specifically if they're cloud-based and they're focused on Linux, they're going to, storage people in that space are going to need to understand, obviously, the storage infrastructure, and then a little bit of networking, because most of your storage nowadays runs over the network. So you need to understand the basics of troubleshooting there, Fiber channel, iSCSI, all these different protocols, NFS. Those are all the different protocols that storage relates from server to storage. And then that will then go into Kubernetes, because you will often have to use storage drivers from vendors. So even if you're in your own data center and you have a storage vendor's thing, they're probably going to have a Kubernetes CSI plugin with a controller that you're going to have to give advice on, like which versions of that controller are compatible with your storage vendor's tools, right? So you are definitely going to have to manage that relationship. You might not be typing Kubernetes commands all day long, but I used to run a storage team, and those storage people had to know the OS that they were running it on. So in that case, they were running on mostly Windows, but some Linux. And so they had to understand, their iSCSI plugins that supported their particular storage product had to be these certain versions and had to have these certain features enabled. So they had to know the OSs. And so I actually encouraged, I wouldn't say forced, but I encouraged those people on my team to go get OS certifications so that they better understood how their storage was used. Because if they don't understand mount files and they don't understand iSCSI and how that relates to the operating system and NFS, then it's really kind of hard for them to provide any value to the storage team, to the ops team, to people who need the storage that they're providing. So I would argue, yes, you probably don't need to go get certifications on Docker and Kubernetes, but I would, as you expand your horizons in storage, I would recommend not only learning those protocols, the networking stuff, some of the OS stuff, but then you eventually learn things like the basics of containers and Kubernetes. You want to know, I would say, to be able to take a sample application, you don't have to know how the software in that application works or how to develop in that application, but how to deploy something on Kubernetes with your custom storage of whatever the storage you're providing to your teams. You need to know how to do that so that when they can't get the storage connected, maybe it's a permissions problem, maybe it's a networking problem, the storage just isn't getting there, you should be able to help out. Right? You don't have to be the expert on all that stuff, but you should be able to be a part of that troubleshooting team, provide advice. I would expect you to be able to do that. Anyway, that's a great question. Thanks for that. Do I have any plans to discuss setting up on-premise Kubernetes clusters? So by on-premise, if you were to say Rancher, because Rancher is one of the tools that makes it easier to deploy on-prem Kubernetes, then yes, I think in my Kubernetes mastery course, I want to add a section on Rancher. It's not in there yet, but that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the future of those courses. But I don't have a timeline for that, so I don't know when that will happen. The challenge with on-prem is that everything is different and everything's custom. So I might tell you one way to do it, but then it's not going to work because you're not running an OS that may work with that one. For example, I like microkates, and microkates now supports multi-node, but I've never seen anyone running that in production in their office. Maybe you can, but I've not seen people do it. People are usually choosing things like Rancher, VMware, other major platforms. And I don't want to make a course on VMware. That's just not me. And I don't recommend vanilla. So for most teams, unless you have a large dedicated team of Kubernetes experts, I don't recommend to people to custom install upstream vanilla Kubernetes, basically the stuff from GitHub. We call that vanilla. I always recommend a distribution. And then once you pick your distribution, the entire course would be different. You would have different storage stuff, different networking stuff, different admin GUI interfaces. So that's what gets really challenging with Kubernetes is that I don't want to make a vendor specific course, but you're going to have to do that. You're going to have to go down that road once you start to choose on-prem. So Anyway, hopefully that answers that question. Mike's suggesting, have I tried Wayback Machine to see if it was cached somewhere? Wayback would cache a website, and yes, I did use that to get some of the history of it. I love the Wayback Machine. In fact, for those of you who don't know, that's the Internet Archive, and they're a nonprofit organization of which I support. When you buy my courses, you actually are contributing a little bit to those organizations. I donate to them regularly, and I love the fact that we have a internet history, basically protection of things like this. However, the Internet Archive does not archive GitHub repos. It doesn't copy the entire GitHub repo with all the source code in it. It's just looking at web pages. So it had a few things, but it didn't really have anything that I could use to recreate the software. But thanks, Mike. That's a great idea. How to integrate and configure storage cluster in Kubernetes 121. Provide some technical info. I don't have any. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people need to install Onprem, and I get it. It's just a matter of time. Like, what's the priorities, and how many people can take advantage of maybe me talking about something like AWS or DigitalOcean versus very specific on-prem deployments. It's just a question of what is the biggest bang for the buck. What can I get into? So I'd love to make a course every month and crank out a new Kubernetes course every month. I'm just, it's just me and a few part-time helpers. So I don't have that as much time as I'd like to be able to make additional courses. So sadly, I have to make tough choices. I think my next big course, if it's big, is going to be a more generic DevOps course to get people back to the fundamentals of DevOps and more about the people side of it, not so technical. And I've talked about that last year, and I've had to delay it this year because I ended up getting really involved with Dockercon and whatnot. So I had to push that back a little bit, but that's probably my next course after I refresh the current ones. Sure thing. Thank you, Raghandenden. Sorry if I messed that up. The course updates are overdue, and I appreciate everyone being patient for those updates because, life gets in the way. We all get busy. Thanks for all the thanks for everyone. Yep, GitHub Actions is I love GitHub Actions. Nowadays, if you got your code in GitHub, you should look at GitHub Actions by default. Like that should be your go-to. And then the only reason you need some other platform is if GitHub Actions doesn't do what you need it to do. For maybe it doesn't have all the deployment features you want yet. So you maybe need to add on another tool for enhanced deployments. But in terms of testing, I would try using it first before anything else. What is the future of Docker containers on K8's versions? Do we need to learn Docker or any other container technologies like Containerd or CRI-O? Well, when you're running Kubernetes, you're going to be always using the Kubernetes command lines. Like it's very, very, very rare, and it's only in rare troubleshooting scenarios where you're going to need to talk to the Kubernetes controller, the kubelet controlled container runtime. So I was trying to say, because on every node you've got kubelet, and then that's going to control Docker, CRI-O, Containerd, which are the three main tools. There are other ones out there that do different things than they can control other infrastructure, and some of them are actually add-ons for containerd. But those are very specific cases. So I would say no, you don't need to learn those tools. Docker is still the tool you use locally. Like Docker is now the tool that's all focused on running containers locally and then running containers on a single server or on a few servers if you don't need Kubernetes. But once you go to Kubernetes, you're probably going to pick a distribution, and that distribution is going to choose your container runtime for you. It's going to pick it. Almost always, it's going to pick it. So it's probably going to use containerd unless it's Red Hat based. So then Red Hat would use Cryo. If some technologies still prefer Docker as the runtime underneath, and Mirantis, there was a year and a half ago there was news. Was it a year and a half ago, or maybe just a half a year ago? It seems like such a long time ago. Docker, the Kubernetes team announced that they were no longer going to support the Docker shim. This is a piece in the middle that allows Kubernetes to use Docker. It's always been there. They just didn't want to support it anymore. And so Mirantis basically showed up, which is a company that bought part of Docker a few years ago. And Mirantis just showed up and said, hey, we'll support it. So now they have their unsupported version of that. So if you still want to use Docker under Kubernetes, which a lot of people do when they want a continuous integration tool set, they will use Docker underneath Kubernetes, and then basically their pods will run. They will talk to the Docker engine directly. There's ways to do that. And so that's a good reason. That's one good reason to use Docker, because Kubernetes doesn't, out of the box, build containers. It doesn't build images, rather. So you need some other tool. And there's now an increased set of tools out there for building images on top of Kubernetes. But one way people used to do it was with Docker. So you can still do that. Just look up Docker shim Mirantis, and you can find that. But no, I don't think that you need to necessarily invest a ton of time unless you're someone who needs to troubleshoot and really know the deep internals. Then I recommend learning containerd. But you're not going to use containerd day to day, right? You're not going to be typing, is it CRT or CR? I'm trying to remember the containerd command line tool. Anyway, you don't need to use that day to day. PCS. So I have, if you just go to there's a link below in the YouTube chat. Not in the chat, but in the description, there's a link to my courses where the course coupons are. I only have 4 courses at this point that are current. I have old courses that Hyper-V and stuff like that on different platforms. But the ones that I still maintain are those 4 courses, all on Udemy. And the only other one that besides the Docker and the Kubernetes mastery that I plan to continue to support is the Docker for Node.js. The Swarm mastery course, I think that one's kind of finished. Like, that is what it is. And I don't see, unless Swarm gets a major update with its new planned CSI support, I don't see myself updating that really with anything in addition. It sells the least amount of all 4 of my courses. So most people are shifting away from Swarm at this point because we don't really have a good way to do a lot of the things in Swarm that we now can do in Kubernetes, like shared storage. What else? Custom networking. A lot of that stuff never really got added, and the community didn't circle around Swarm. So it's still a great tool for running simple little workloads that you don't need databases in your Swarm. If you just use some other hosting provider to provide your database, then you can still use Swarm. It's great. But it's one of those things where people are probably going to have to run Kubernetes anyway at some point for some other part of their infrastructure. So you might as well just stick with one orchestrator in all the places that you need it. So it's kind of in some cases forcing people that like Swarm to go to Kubernetes just because their organization is going there and they can't stop the transition. Am I going to cover Argo CD or Flux in future courses? Yes, that will be added. That is actually in the list to be added to Kubernetes Mastery. And I probably will do small amounts in that course. You can actually see at the very end of Kubernetes Mastery the list of the stuff that's going to come next. And maybe in the future I'll do a GitOps course once we get some more tools in that ecosystem and we kind of flesh out all that stuff. I can make it once it's more stabilized. I can make a course that's not going to break in 6 months because things are totally different. How can we use Visual Studio Code Docker plugin and connect to an external Docker? So look up SSH Docker. All right. So the way, I don't know how to tell you that, like I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but the way you now can use the Docker command line on your machine to talk to remote Docker endpoints is you can either change the environment variable, the Docker host, to SSH:/ and then an SSH URL. So look that up. In fact, there are other videos in this YouTube channel that I have explained that a couple of times. So maybe look up SSH. But basically, Docker has a built-in SSH tunnel. So you probably just can look up some, stuff on Google to figure out, or Bing it, whatever. You can look up Docker remote SSH, basically those 3 keywords, and you'll find tons of examples on the different ways you can use Docker context to remotely control a Docker machine through SSH without having to manually SSH into the server, right? I'm not talking about that. The old way we did it many years ago was we would tell Docker to basically expose a port and we'd put a certificate on it, a TLS certificate. And I don't recommend doing that anymore. There's really no reason to do that because we now have this built-in SSH ability for the command line. What is the path to go from Docker local development to deploying to Kubernetes? Well, the short answer to that is you need your code you need to have commits in a Git repo, and then you need to have a CI workflow that, based on your requirements, whether it's every commit or only commits to branch, the master branch or the main branch, or however you want to do it, those commits spin up a CI workflow automatically that will then build and test and then push an image. So you're going to build the image, the Docker image, you're going to test it, and if all those tests pass, then you're going to push it to a Docker registry somewhere, doesn't matter which one, and then that last that last part there is continuous deployment. Sometimes in the newest tools, we call it GitOps, if you're doing Git-based tooling for deploying. And there are tools to do that and help you do that. There's Flux. Some people just mentioned that Argo CD and Flux are 2 popular tools. You might just have your CI tool do a very simplistic deployment by just doing Docker and Kubernetes commands, but eventually you'll probably look at something like a GitOps tool to do that. So it's probably going to be a combination of tools, but think of it as you're building the image, you're testing the image, you're automatically pushing it to a registry, and then you're going to have another tool usually. This can all be done in GitHub Actions, but you're probably going to need something like Flux or Argo CD, which uses Git-based repos, and it will look for changes. So you'll either go and change some YAML in one of those repos. Think of it as your ops repo. You'll go change some YAML there, and then Flux or Argo will deploy based on your changes to the cluster that you asked to change. Or those tools can watch your image versions in your registry, and when it sees a new image get pushed with a specific tag to the registry, then it will take that image and push it to your servers because it'll know everything else, and then it'll just update the image essentially. So anyway, that's kind of the flow. And there's a bunch of different tools that all try to do it. There are some other tools out there that try to put it all in one, which is they have CI and CD all in one. That's fine too. Yeah, that's the short answer. Great question. What would be the 1 to 2 features that you think Docker or K8s had that would have helped, let's say, companies beginning to use it or avoid struggling with it? Well, I think at this point, a lot of us are wishing that Docker had a way to deploy so that you didn't have to completely change your tooling just to get the code, your images from local to servers. But we now have that, and Docker is building that into the Docker tool. So you can now do Docker space compose. Go to Dockercon, dockercon.com, watch all the videos there about compose, and those tools will describe to you all the new features in Docker Compose that allow you to automatically deploy to things like ACI with Azure or with ECS in AWS. And they're working on more drivers there so that you can basically deploy containers without using Kubernetes at this point. And I think eventually what that tool will also do is allow you to do a Docker Compose up against different endpoints that are Kubernetes. And we don't have that yet, but it's kind of if you read the tea leaves a little bit on where they're what they're trying to do with this. I can see us, maybe not this year, but I can see us having a Docker Compose up that deploys against some sort of Kubernetes backend. And maybe it's just a cloud that supports it. So like maybe it's an EKS or a JKE, a GKE, or a DigitalOcean apps, I think is what they call it. And then there's also DigitalOcean Kubernetes. But anyway, using Cloud API specifically and not Kubernetes API, that could be a thing with Docker Compose. So I think that that's the biggest thing, really, is that Kubernetes was meant for operators to design and maintain large clusters of servers all running containers. It is not designed to make it easier for developers to deploy containers into clusters or into the internet or cloud or whatever. And that's what Docker's focused on. So they just don't really have the tool. They've tried a couple times. They've done different things. They've done something called Docker App. They have something called Docker Cloud. All these things have come and gone with Docker. So I think Docker has tried to experiment with ways to get developers easier access to servers for deploying. Obviously, they had Swarm Classic. They've had lots of different ways to do it. But I think this new idea is, instead of them building their own orchestrator tool like Swarm, and instead of them creating their own distribution of Kubernetes, which that's not Docker's focus anymore, is maybe they just use cloud APIs, and they just ECS and ACI, those kind of tools, and just deploy to those. That way, Docker gets out of the server business and stays where they're good at in the container and image business for developers. Career advice, Monis. I'm currently working as a sysadmin, particularly on VMware, and want to move in on DevOps systems. Tell me how I should plan my roadmap. Taking my courses. There are lots of DevOps roadmaps out there. I have a URL I will give you. Bret.show/DevOps. And Bret.show/DevOps is just basically a GitHub issue where I dump a bunch of thoughts about getting into DevOps, tools to learn, ideas on other good courses to take, and so try that stuff out. Great question. If you have built a website, this is from apt-get, the apt-get, if you have built a website, why should you store it on a container and not on a server? Because you're going to have to replace that server. And a container with that website in it allows it to run the same way everywhere where you run it. So you run it locally, you run it on Amazon, you run it on Ubuntu, you run it on CentOS. That website's got dependencies. You're running that website on something, Apache, Node, PHP, something. So that means you got dependency installers. And those are going to be different in every distribution of Linux, on every machine you're going to run it on. And we called that the matrix of hell. Docker kind of coined that term. So no matter what software you're running, if it's got to run on a web server or it's got to run on a server somewhere, you're going to have the matrix of hell. That is, how does a developer set it up locally? How does a server person set it up? How should CI test it? Well, when you've containerized it, the answer to all that is the same. And it's a consistent image everywhere. So that's why. There's a ton of other reasons, but we'll stick with that one. Good question. Ram Krishna, working with respect to virtualization, a bit confused with VMware and VirtualBox. VMware and VirtualBox are just two different ways to run two different products, and they both run virtual machines. VirtualBox is free, and you use that on your local machine. You don't really use that on servers in production. You don't really use that on the internet. VMware is nowadays what they are is really they have a ton of tools, from desktop tools to server tools, all for running containers. But if you're using cloud, in most cases, you don't use either one of those. You just use what the cloud provides as a virtual machine. Good tip, Michael. Thank you. On VS Code Remote SSH. You might be correct. I do believe I played with that one day, and it does work well. apt-get asks, do companies still build KAs for themselves? So that's called vanilla. Yes, plenty of companies still deploy vanilla, but they have to really know Kubernetes well to do that securely and safely. I always advise people use a cloud-hosted provided solution until you have a good reason not to. And that's why the cloud's there. The cloud is full of experts. Amazon hires hundreds and hundreds of Kubernetes experts. I would say at this point, probably thousands. Who knows? Across the clouds, right? But a lot of people, they have a lot of smart people, and they don't put a product out until it's well tested. You know, it's got backups, it's got all the thing, the monitoring. And if you're going to do it yourself, you have to do it yourself. You have to do all of that. And why? I mean, there are a few reasons, obviously, but for most people, use the one in the cloud. Good question. Thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed the Easy CI live panel as well. It was fun. Hello, Sandeep. Hello, hello. Compose for prod in 2021 is already suitable. So, Ivan, I'm thinking that you're referencing how I often will say Docker Compose is not meant for production. And what I was really talking about was Docker-Compose, the old Compose that was written in Python, it doesn't do things that you need in production. It doesn't do health checks. It doesn't replace containers when the health check fails. It doesn't understand multi-node clusters. It only knows the local system. There's some weird edge cases where if it reboots, it won't capture environment variables if you're using those in the YAML files. There's all sorts of little edge cases around lifecycle and what we call day 2 ops with the old Docker Compose. Now, Docker is building a new Compose, and you just look that up on GitHub at Docker/. Let's go there. I love the new Compose. The new Compose is great. So Compose CLI. This is an add-in for Docker, the command line. It's written in Go, so it's more efficient, smaller, easier to install. And this new one, you could still install it on a server and run it on a server. But I would argue that that's not really Docker's focus. Their focus is to get these plugins in so that you can do Docker Compose up against Azure ACI, Docker Compose up against AWS's ECS. And then I think more are coming. I hope someday there'll be EKS there and maybe a DigitalOcean option and other options there as well. Maybe deploying directly to a Kubernetes cluster. That doesn't matter, just anything with a Kubernetes API. I think that's their focus, not so much making the Docker engine with Compose work well on a single system. I also don't think they're going to make this thing, respond to health checks, replace containers when they failed, do rolling updates. All the reasons that I have this article. Let's see. Yeah. Bret.show/compose or swarm. So I have this article that's been around for years. And we go back and forth basically talking about, I give all the reasons why using something like Swarm, if you're just on a single server with a single set of containers in a Compose file, it's still better to use Swarm in that case than Compose. And I list all the reasons why, including rolling updates, health checks, replacing failed containers, stuff like that. Anyway, I'll put that in chat. But the new Compose, the approach on the new Compose is you're not going to run your own server anymore. Like, you're going to deploy against cloud infrastructure in most cases. Great question. Sandeep has a very specific ask. They want a video on OpenID Connect for cloud managed Kubernetes. I've never had to do that. So I know teams that do that, and I've been involved with them, but I never had to set that up. So sorry. Any thoughts on GitHub Actions versus Jenkins? Company uses GitHub Actions, but I am in a more ops-centric role. Not sure if learning it in depth would be wasted. I think at this point, Jenkins is still the majority, but everyone is looking for a way to get off of it. Like every team that I know has it. It's there, but they're not doubling down on Jenkins, and they're only doing it because that's what they know how to do, and they're looking at other ways to replace it with easier tools, maybe cloud-based tools that are SaaS. They're a service that they don't have to build their own infrastructure. And right now, GitHub Actions is, I think, that should be the default for everyone in every business, especially specifically if you're storing your code on GitHub. So one of the reasons that GitHub Actions is key, there's a couple of things that I really like about it. One is that if your developer teams are already on GitHub, then you're meeting them where they already are. You're not saying, go use this other tool that you're going to have to learn that's totally different, totally separate, not related, has its own settings. You're keeping them in GitHub. And even if you're someone who's not storing your code in GitHub, maybe you're using Bitbucket or something, you're going to have to use GitHub all day anyway, because most of the open source you're using is stored on GitHub. So you're already on GitHub all day. So just make it easier for everyone. Now, GitHub Actions is relatively new, especially compared to Jenkins. So it doesn't have all the features, and it can't do everything well. Deployments are the future of GitHub Actions. For instance, we just recently got something called environments that allows us to store environment variables per environment in GitHub, which is an important part of deployments because you're going to have more than one environment. But that part is still relatively new. So this maybe isn't everything you're ever going to want, but I love the simplicity of it. I love how easy it is to use, and what I'm particularly excited about is the marketplace. I just want what the three things that I really like. The things I look for in a CI platform, CI/CD, is easy to support and deploy and maintain the platform itself, and in this case, it's GitHub doing it for you. The availability of add-ons and how easy and well maintained those are to use. So they've got to be well maintained by the original companies, and there's got to be lots of options that are well supported. There's lots of people using it. And Jenkins definitely has that, but one of the problems with Jenkins is because it's so old, some of these are really old tools that have they were built in a different mindset back before containers were even built. So a lot of their stuff is not container focused. And GitHub, I would say GitHub Actions is designed for containers. Each one of the steps is running a container. Well, you don't actually I don't think you have to. Well, maybe you do. I could be wrong on that. Anyway, it's container native. I would say it's container focused. But if I go to the GitHub, if I go to the marketplace, right, and just search for anything, what you'll tend to find nowadays, for example, if you need to do a security scan, the security scan companies have a GitHub marketplace add-on. If you want to use Docker has official marketplace supported actions. These are all the companies now that make software stuff that you need to use inside of your CI or CD tools. They're all on the GitHub bandwagon because they know this is like the 800-pound gorilla. This is where they've got to be. They've got to be here first. So everyone's got a connection. Everyone's got an add-on. If you try something like the open source tool Drone, which has been around 6 years, I think, the problem there is not that many things. A lot of things are missing or features not there yet. And, for example, out of the box with Drone, you can't use a mono repo very well. You have to get a third-party add-on from someone on GitHub that doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of community behind it. It feels kind of, and it's a key feature. Like it should just be there, but it's not. So I tend to default to GitHub Actions for everything. And I would say, no, you're not wasted in learning it. Can I get free stuff related to programming in Udemy? I don't know. There are always free courses on there, but I don't take any of them. So, what could be the limitation in cloud-hosted or managed K8 solutions? I think the biggest limitation is if you need to customize the system itself for some reason. I have custom hardware, custom kernels, custom kernel settings, and I don't, there's lots of reasons, but I don't have any off the top of my head. That's going to be hard to do in those managed and cloud provided. They're going to manage all that for you. So if you need something different, and you're only going to know that if you try it, and then you have a specific requirement that doesn't work, and then you'll go, oh, okay, well, I guess I can't use this. Mike asks, thanks for the HTTP source code. I'll check out that link after the live here. Would I consider tips and tricks of creating a Udemy course? Yeah, I think. I mean, maybe not on creating a Udemy course, because I don't know that I'm necessarily that good at it. Maybe more on the side of like, how do I make my videos? Like, once I have some content, once I have like a syllabus and I know what I want to talk about, what software do I use? What hardware do I use? You can actually check out all that right now at kit.co/Bret Fisher. I put this in chat. This is all the gear I use, software and hardware. So you can see I really just have just two kits, but one of them is this home studio setup, and then one is when I'm on the road, and it includes software. And then the Amazon links here give me a little bit of kickback, so I make a little money off like if you were to buy this lens, so thank you if you did. Some people do. And I get a check from Amazon. I get like $50 every month or something. Not much, but you can check out the kit.co. But yeah, I would consider doing that. I'm pretty sure I answered that question, apt-get, but yeah, GitHub Actions. Jenkins X, I wouldn't bother with that. Jenkins X is an attempt to, it has nothing to do with Jenkins. It's Kubernetes focused CI platform. And I would say at this point, I don't see a lot of people using it, but I'm also not in the Jenkins community. So I would say people are using Flux and Argo and GitHub Actions. I see that a lot. And if people aren't using it, they're learning them and considering using them a lot. So you can kind of see the trend. Do you see a future for a Kubernetes engineer? By that I mean somebody who runs Kubernetes, deploys apps with little or no involvement in application development. There already is that today. Those people are ops. So you would be on the ops team where you're building Kubernetes clusters, you're managing them, you're making sure they're monitored, you're supporting the logging solutions for those, you're supporting the permissions model, the RBAC, all that stuff. So absolutely, the larger the company, the more likely they're going to need a dedicated team of Kubernetes engineers that are ops focused, that know some development, know a little bit about the development world, but they're much more on the ops side of managing the infrastructure to run Kubernetes. What do I think about the compose specification? I think it's fantastic. And yes, all of my compose files no longer have versions in them. And I'm going to be updating the courses to remove all those versions completely. The only time you still need a version in a compose file is if you're using Swarm. Swarm is still requiring the version 3 at the top of it. But we now have, for all other versions of Compose, whether it's Docker-Compose or Docker Space Compose, all those now use the Compose specification, which doesn't have a version. It basically just has features. And if you use that feature, then it will know to use that part of the compose specification. So absolutely, I use it every day, 100%, unless I'm using Swarm, and then I have to put v3 in. GitLab CI is another great solution. Lots of people use it. Lots of people love it. I would say with GitLab, the more you use it, it's designed to be an all-in-one tool. So if you're going to store your code there, then use the rest of the tools as much as you can. Stay in the ecosystem. Keep your developers and your teams in the same tool all day long, instead of pulling a bunch of different separate tools together. Every team I see that tries to do that, where every one of their tools, they've got 6, 7, 8 tools, and they're all over the place, totally different vendors. It always makes it harder in the long term. Great question. All right. I'm losing my voice a little bit, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks for all these great questions. I see some final questions here. AWS certification. I don't have one. I don't have an AWS certification. When I got to 30 certifications, I just kind of stopped, and I never went for an AWS one. So I don't have a recommendation there. Jenkins and Flux CD. Jenkins is really an old CI tool. I mean, it's basically a workflow runner. It can do whatever you want it to do. It's almost like a really advanced cron. It has no opinions, thousands of plugins. Flux CD is specifically designed to deploy your workloads on Kubernetes. That's all it does. All right. Well, thank everyone else for the questions. Unfortunately, this hour is a little bit over. We're over on time a little bit, and my allergies are catching up with me on my throat. So I'm going to have to say ciao and see you next week. I'll be back here same time. Thank you all to my supporters on Patreon. Please go to patreon.com/Bret Fisher, and you can sponsor and support this channel. Those people are the reason I'm still doing this. See you guys next week. Ciao.